The cup was warm, but the tea untouched. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Comment and tell me where in the world you're watching today. Your notes are the heart of this channel. Let's begin. It was the kind of afternoon that made even the most stubborn of hedgerows pause for breath. The village of Lower Hemsby, tucked like a pressed flower between Wiltshire's slow hills and winding lanes, basked in the mild blush of spring. Plum trees sighed beneath the weight of their own bloom, and bees trundled drunkenly through the air, clumsy with ambition. It was the first truly warm Saturday of the season, and it belonged to the Women's Guild Spring Fete. The green behind St. Mildred's was speckled with folding chairs and striped parasols, bunting fluttering between the ancient yew trees like faded confessions. Tables buckled slightly under the weight of sponge cakes, fruit jams, and lemon cordials. Children, already grass-stained and sugar-happy, tore through clusters of knees. Beneath all this domestic gaiety, the gossip of Lower Hemsby hummed like a second breeze, one that, if listened to properly, could tell you who had taken whom to task over the vicar's sermon, who had spent rather too long in the company of the butcher's new apprentice, and who had, despite every assurance otherwise, let their begonias die over winter. Miss Jane Marple, small and silver-haired, in a sensible blue straw hat, stood at the edge of the rose competition tent, watching it all with the gentle eyes of a woman who saw more than she let on. Her gloved fingers were curled delicately around the handle of a wicker bag, and her face bore an expression of polite interest, a veil behind which her mind ticked and tested. "They're judging the Victoria sponges at 3:30, murmured Mrs. Weatherby beside her, dabbing at her temple with a monogrammed handkerchief despite the lack of heat. Though everyone knows Madge Harmons will win again, honestly, she must butter the judges as thoroughly as her cake tins." Miss Marple offered a small smile. "Madge has always had very steady hands," she said mildly. "It's quite rare, actually, a steady hand under pressure. One notices such things." But before Mrs. Weatherby could sniff a reply, a shriek rose from the tea tent. It was not the melodramatic squeal of spilt punch or a wayward child. It was something stranger, thinner, more brittle. And it came from Veronica Drake. Veronica, gold-bangled, sharp-chinned, and recently returned from somewhere near Madeira, was standing with her fingers splayed over her mouth, eyes fixed on the empty porcelain teapot in front of her. People gathered at once. A dozen bodies crowded the mouth of the tent like sheep at a broken gate. Miss Marple remained at the back, as she often did, where the air was clearer and people spoke more freely. Veronica's voice cut through the growing murmur. "It's gone. The tea. It was here just now. I left it for a moment to fetch the milk, and now it's gone." Mrs. Finch, who'd been pouring cups when last seen, frowned and leaned forward. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "I mean," Veronica snapped, then caught herself and lowered her tone into something more civilized. "I mean, I brewed a full pot. Assam, my own blend, brought back in a valise. It had just finished steeping. I turned away for no more than 2 minutes, and now the pot's empty. Bone dry. Look," she held it up. A perfectly lovely porcelain pot with violets on the lid and not a drop of liquid left inside. A few laughed nervously. The idea of tea vanishing was absurd, and that absurdity, to most of Lower Hemsby, was comforting. But not to Miss Marple. Not when Veronica Drake's voice shook not with offence, but with fear. Later that day, just before sunset, the fete wound to its sleepy end. Children were gathered up. Bunting was unpinned with practised efficiency, and leftover scones were wrapped in paper serviettes and handed out like parting gifts. By then, Veronica Drake had vanished as well. She had not been seen since the incident in the tea tent. "Temper," said Mrs. Finch with a dismissive shrug. "She's always had a flare-up when something doesn't go quite to plan, likely stomped off. She'll turn up when someone flatters her baking again." But she didn't, not that evening, not the next morning either. It wasn't until the Monday post arrived that anyone in Lower Hemsby took serious notice. When Mr. Sims, the postmaster, discovered an envelope in the overnight delivery tray with no stamp, no return address, and no postmark. Inside was a single note. It read, "Tell them I'm not steeped in lies, but someone else is. V." 3 hours later, Veronica Drake's body was found in the sitting room of her cottage at Honeysuckle End, neatly dressed, hands folded on her lap, and a cup of untouched tea beside her. The teapot, however, was missing. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window that evening, her knitting untouched in her lap. Outside, the hedgerows rustled, and the lanes whispered the beginnings of a scandal. But Miss Marple's eyes were fixed inward, recalling every face at the fete, every whispered word, every eye that had darted toward the tea tent when the shriek first pierced the air. She was afraid, Miss Marple said softly to herself. Not of being embarrassed, not of her tea going missing. She was afraid of being right, and with that, she reached for her knitting again. The first stitch was always the most important, and the one most often dropped. The next morning, Lower Hemsby stirred with something other than its usual sleepiness. At Ye Olde Bakery, the scones were still warm and the raspberry turnovers still glistened under glass, but the air inside felt brittle with speculation. Mrs. Weatherby leaned against the counter in her mauve tweed, pressing one palm flat as she murmured, to the girl behind the till, "A note like that doesn't just write itself, dear. That's what I told Ethel. A woman doesn't say something so cryptic unless she knows something very real." The girl nodded with more politeness than conviction. Outside, a pair of older men passed slowly along the cobbled high street. Their voices, usually reserved for weather and cricket scores, lowered in tone. "Dead, you say? Properly dead." "Sitting up," they said, just like she was waiting for someone. "No struggle, just gone. No sign of poison either, not yet. And they say there was no teapot, not a single drop of tea left in the whole house." At the other end of the village, Miss Marple was trimming a small pot of fuchsias. Her hands moved deftly, but her eyes weren't focused on the leaves. They flicked occasionally toward the lane, watching as a black saloon car rolled past and paused briefly outside Honeysuckle End. The constable stepped out with a clipboard in hand, his uniform too crisp for how little he seemed to know. Miss Marple did not comment, not yet. She merely snipped one more stem, dusted the edge of the terracotta pot with a gloved finger, and set it gently back in place. There was a knock at her gate a moment later. It was Lenora Finch, looking flushed beneath her broad-brimmed hat, though whether from exertion or excitement it was hard to say. She gave a little huff and waved a folded newspaper. "Have you heard the latest, Miss Marple? There's a preliminary post-mortem report, got passed to Rupert via that nephew of his in the coroner's office. Apparently, there's nothing in her system, no toxins, no damage. She just, well, expired." Miss Marple looked mildly concerned. "As one does when their heart stops, I suppose. But it shouldn't have, not at her age. She was fit, wasn't she? She always gave the impression of being vigorous," said Miss Marple calmly. "Though I did wonder, during the fete, if something had unsettled her deeply." Her voice cracked at the end of her sentence just slightly. Most people wouldn't notice such things. Lenora leaned forward. "Do you think she was poisoned after all?" "I think people rarely die at random, dear, even when nature claims to be responsible." Lenora's eyes lit. "And the note? That dreadful little scrap? Not steeped in lies. What do you make of it?" "I make of it what I make of all hurried notes written before death," Miss Marple said, folding her gloves neatly in her lap. "A person says what is most on their mind, not what they think others will understand." "Meaning?" She wasn't explaining. She was warning. The constable was no great detective. His name was Michael Wren, a recent arrival from Salisbury who still found Lower Hemsby quaint. He had dutifully sealed the cottage at Honeysuckle End and taken statements from precisely 3 people. Mrs. Bishop, who had seen nothing but heard Veronica's radio playing too loudly that morning; Ethel Pike, who delivered the milk and found it still untouched on the step. And Mr. Crowsley, the man who had gone to collect a borrowed umbrella and found the door ajar. By Tuesday morning, no arrests had been made. No cause of death had been declared. The villagers, deprived of answers, filled the void with their own. "I bet it was the tea," said George Ellesmere, over his morning paper in the Gables tea room. "She probably used some newfangled herbal nonsense, one of those foreign mixes, gave herself a fit." "Then where's the pot?" asked his wife flatly. "They found a cup on the sideboard, didn't they?" "No saucer, no pot. You can't pour from a memory." "A burglary?" offered another voice. Someone who knew she had valuables. Or a secret, perhaps. That note, what was it? Something about lies being steeped, or not steeped. "Could have been blackmail," muttered someone else. "She travelled a lot, picked up all kinds of ideas. Lived abroad for nearly a year. They say she had a man in Madeira." But Miss Marple, who sat at her corner table beneath the tall window, sipping plain Earl Grey, heard something different. The villagers were frightened. Not of being next. Lower Hemsby wasn't that dramatic, but of what Veronica might have known, of what might now come to light. It was the look in their eyes, the way heads turned a little too quickly when the subject changed, the way voices lowered not in sadness, but in calculation. And there was something else. Veronica had stood in that tea tent, trembling, insisting her pot of Assam had vanished. But a pot of Assam did not simply disappear. It would have taken time for someone to sneak in, empty the entire thing, and leave without being seen, especially in the middle of the fete, with half the village within earshot. Unless, of course, it had never been poured in the first place. Miss Marple turned that thought over in her mind as she walked slowly back to her cottage. On the corner near the florist, she paused, her gaze settling on a poster for the spring fete. The bold cursive read, "Tea served all afternoon." Below that, in finer print, supplied in part by donations from the ladies of the parish, she thought again of Veronica Drake, bold, stylish, unnerved, and the way she'd clutched that pot as if it held something more than leaves, something that had been meant as proof, or perhaps as bait. That night, Miss Marple wrote a short letter on her heavy cream stationery and addressed it to a friend in the county records office. She had a quiet suspicion forming, a thread she meant to tug gently, not about Veronica's final days, but about a matter from 22 years earlier. As she folded the letter and sealed the envelope, her fingers paused for a moment on the edge of the paper. A memory rose, of a summer garden, laughter in the background, and a woman with a fresh scar hidden by a silk scarf. She pressed the wax seal down, steady and firm. In Lower Hemsby, people had begun whispering, but Miss Marple had begun listening. The difference, as she knew well, was everything. By Wednesday morning, the mist rolled in low over the hedgerows, and Lower Hemsby had turned grey and contemplative. The spring sun, so bold at the fete, now seemed shy. At Honeysuckle End, the yellow tape the constable had tied to the gate flapped uselessly in the breeze, a crude mark against the rose trellis Veronica Drake had once pruned with obsessive care. The police presence had thinned. All that remained was the weight of questions nobody yet had the courage or cunning to ask. Miss Marple, however, had risen early. She did not care for brooding in bed. Instead, she moved about her modest sitting room with the quiet industry of someone who was not looking for answers, but waiting for the right one to float to the surface. That morning, it arrived with a knock. "I hope I'm not disturbing—" "Not in the least, Inspector Cray," she said, already stepping aside. He was a large man, not from the village but stationed out of Devizes, sent in when cases strayed from the tidy paths of accidents and domestic theft. His moustache was severe, and his shoes polished, but he looked tired. His fingers tapped restlessly against the brim of his hat, even after it was off. "I understand," Miss Marple said, offering him a seat, "that you've confirmed there were no toxic substances found in Miss Drake's body." He nodded. Heart stopped. No explanation. Nothing in her bloodstream, lungs, or digestive tract. No trauma. It's baffling. I've sent for a more detailed report, but so far, nothing. She was drinking tea. She wasn't, as it happens, Cray replied. The cup beside her was untouched, bone dry, though it had a faint residue. But again, no drugs found. Miss Marple's brows lifted delicately. No tea in the cup, no teapot found, and yet the residue of a liquid present. Curious, wouldn't you say? I would, he said grimly. Especially since, as I've learned this morning, the tea Veronica Drake brought to the fete was never logged among the guild's official contributions. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. So she brought it herself. So it seems. And not just any tea. Assam, supposedly, though no one else tasted it. Mrs. Pike, who helped arrange the table, says the pot never left Veronica's hands. And now the pot is gone, Miss Marple said, mostly to herself. Cray leaned forward, the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed by his lowered voice. You were there, at the fete. What did you see? I saw a woman frightened of something, Miss Marple replied. Not just upset or offended, truly frightened. Not in the moment of the missing tea, but just before, when she was pouring. Her hands were steady, yes, but her eyes were not. She kept glancing at someone behind her. I believe she had brought the tea as a test. A test? Yes. She expected someone to react to it, perhaps even to fear it. He frowned. Then why didn't she serve it? She never had the chance, Miss Marple said. Someone took the pot. Stole it, you think, before she could pour? Or swapped it and made it seem as though she was losing her mind, a quiet way of undoing someone, if you know they're about to reveal something unpleasant. Cray rubbed his temples. You think she was murdered, without poison, without force. Miss Marple's voice was calm. It's quite possible to murder someone using only fear, Inspector, or rather, to let them die by it. He looked sharply at her. She was already carrying the fear. Miss Marple went on gently. Whatever happened that afternoon simply pushed it into her blood. She was preparing to expose someone, and in doing so, she signed her own death warrant. Cray stood slowly. If you're right, we're not dealing with a crime of impulse. Someone planned to silence her. Yes, she said, rising with him. And they did it so cleverly that no one would think to question them, except, perhaps, someone who has spent a great deal of time watching people sit quietly and make excuses. As the inspector left, Miss Marple returned to her writing desk and opened the ledger where she kept notes, not formal observations, just names and snippets, fragments of dialogue overheard at markets or teas. She found the page she'd begun 2 days prior. At the top, Spring Fete, Veronica Drake incident. She added a new line. Veronica afraid. Assam never served. Cup dry. Pot missing. Who saw her pour? Then, she added another name beneath it. M. Harmon, sponge cake winner, near the tea tent, 3:25 p.m. Madge Harmon was a tall, no-nonsense woman with a blunt jaw and a voice that sounded as though it had spent years ordering others out of kitchens. She had won the sponge competition 6 years running, and her pride in the matter was thinly veiled behind modesty that never quite reached her eyes. Miss Marple found her that afternoon kneading dough in the kitchen of the Women's Guild Hall, flour dusted like chalk across her apron. I'm so sorry to trouble you, Madge, Miss Marple said sweetly. But I've been trying to recall something about the fete, and I thought you might help. Oh, I remember you were standing quite near the tea tent when poor Veronica had her episode. Madge grunted. Wasn't an episode. It was a performance. That woman always had a flair for being the centre of things. She did say the pot of tea had gone missing. Quite strange, really. Madge smacked the dough with her palm. I didn't see anyone take it, if that's what you're asking, but I wouldn't be surprised if she made it up. Miss Marple tilted her head. You don't believe her? I don't know what to believe, Madge said, brushing, her hands on a cloth. But I do know she wasn't the angel she pretended to be. Went away for nearly a year, came back with stories about inheritance troubles and property investments. always dodging real questions. Did you know her well before she left? Well enough, Madge replied. Our families crossed paths. Her father was a solicitor, proper man, kept things close. But after he died, let's just say I wouldn't be surprised if Veronica was hiding something. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And yet she came back. Do you think she felt safe here? Madge paused, her mouth tight. I think she thought she did. As Miss Marple stepped out of the guild hall and into the cool afternoon light, she paused by the stone planter outside. The note Veronica had left still echoed in her mind. I'm not steeped in lies. She had not been afraid for herself, not in the conventional sense. She had been afraid because she was trying to tell the truth, which meant someone had silenced her not to keep her quiet, but to keep others from listening. Back at home, Miss Marple opened her drawer and removed a small stack of postcards tied in string. They had been sent from Madeira 2 years earlier and bore brief, friendly messages. They were signed V, but not addressed to her. She had found them in the donation bin at the church jumble sale, a mistake she assumed, but hadn't asked. One in particular caught her attention now. The handwriting was looser, the ink darker. He knows. If anything happens to me, look to the sugar. Miss Marple pressed her fingers against the card. The message was dated precisely 3 weeks before Veronica returned to Lower Hemsby. There had never been any sugar bowl at the Fettes' tea table. Veronica had brought her own, and someone had taken it, just like they had taken the pot. She drew a slow breath. The next visit, she thought, would be to the one woman who never missed a single tea event in Lower Hemsby, and who had once, in a fit of pique, switched the salt for sugar at a harvest lunch to make a point. It was time to visit Sybil Crowsley. Sybil Crowsley lived in a square cottage with ivy strangling the windows and a stiff brass knocker that had to be struck twice before she heard it. When she finally came to the door, she squinted through the lace curtain first, as though visitors might try to sell her something poisonous. Oh, she said, pulling it open with a dry smile. Miss Marple, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Miss Marple inclined her head with courteous gravity. Good afternoon, Sybil. I wondered if I might trouble you for a few moments. About the fate. You might, said Sybil, stepping aside. Though everyone else seems content to trouble me with it whether I say yes or not. Come in then. Don't lean on the banister. It's had a wobble since Christmas. The sitting room was orderly but dense, every shelf groaning with small figurines of animals in hats, and 2 identical Staffordshire dogs glaring down from the mantel. Sybil gestured toward the armchair opposite hers, then poured tea from a silver pot into 2 cups that clinked suspiciously as the tray shifted. Miss Marple accepted her cup, but did not sip. I was thinking about the tea tent, you see, she said, and how very lucky it was that the rest of the supplies weren't disturbed when Veronica Drake's pot went missing. You were helping with the service, weren't you? I organised the entire station, Sybil replied crisply, as I have for 12 years. I set the sugar out myself, arranged the milk jugs, even checked the spoons to ensure they matched. Which they did not, by the way. Margaret Hargraves brought one with a ceramic handle shaped like a goose. Quite hideous. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And the sugar? Was it ordinary cane? It was. Sybil folded her hands in her lap. Though there was some muttering about alternatives. Someone left a small tin of raw sugar, which I removed. It wasn't part of the display, and we don't cater to novelty diets. Quite right, Miss Marple murmured. Who brought the tin, do you recall? Sybil pursed her lips. I believe it was Veronica herself. She had it tucked in her bag, along with that ridiculous infuser. She was quite particular about her tea. She was particular about everything, Sybil replied, her tone tight. She made a grand fuss over it. The leaves must breathe, Sybil, she said. Well, they'd have done better if she hadn't gone flitting about all year. Everyone knows she ran into trouble abroad. What sort of trouble? Oh, I don't speculate, Sybil said with a sniff. But she returned rather abruptly, and thinner too. Never a good sign, unless you're on a magazine cover. Miss Marple set her cup down untouched. You mentioned removing the tin. Did you happen to keep it? Sybil blinked. I did. I thought I might repurpose it for lavender sachets. Why? I'd be most grateful to see it, if you don't mind. Looking suspicious now, Sybil rose and shuffled off to the back pantry. Her slippers scuffed against the linoleum, and something fell with a soft thud before she returned, holding a small silver tin the size of a matchbox. The label had been scratched off. When Miss Marple lifted the lid, the inside was nearly empty. But not quite. Clinging to the corners were a few grains of dark golden sugar. Miss Marple dipped a gloved finger in, pressed one grain to her tongue, and waited. It was gritty, slightly caramelized, but not wholly sweet. I don't believe this was meant for sweetness, she murmured. Are you saying it was poisoned? Sybil looked affronted. I'm saying, Miss Marple said gently, that it may not have been sugar at all. Sybil's mouth tightened, but her eyes shifted. Veronica used it on her own, not with the public table, said she didn't trust processed blends. I didn't think anything of it. It's not my habit to examine what people bring in their handbags. No, Miss Marple said, closing the tin, but it may be someone else's habit to swap what's inside them. She left shortly after, walking slowly along the curved lane that ran past the post office and down toward the vicarage. The air was dense with early evening dew, the kind that muffled footsteps and softened shapes. And as she walked, Miss Marple reflected again on that faint but troubling message. Look to the sugar. What if Veronica had planned to test someone at the fete, to prove that something in the past, something done in secret, had never truly been buried? And what if that test had been stolen from her? The pot taken, the sugar replaced, a warning sent instead of evidence. When she returned home, a small cream envelope lay wedged in her letterbox. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She slit it open carefully, revealing a short note written in an anxious, slanted hand. You were asking about the tea. I didn't see who took it, but I heard something. Someone whispering by the tent. She's not going to let it go. That's what they said. I don't want to be involved. Please don't come asking. I'll deny it. There was no name, only a smudge at the corner, as if the paper had been gripped too tightly. Miss Marple read it 3 times, then folded it neatly and set it beneath her paperweight. The phrase was telling. She's not going to let it go. Not just about the tea, then. Something older. Something longer held. She lit a lamp and sat back in her chair, watching the flame flutter slightly. Veronica had been afraid, but not of exposure. She had been afraid of being silenced before she could speak, and someone in the village, someone who had spoken with her at the fete, had known precisely what to remove to ensure her words never landed. The pot was still missing. So was the sugar bowl she'd brought. But the cup, the single cup left beside her lifeless hand, had held residue. A stain of something bitter and half-sweet. Someone had tampered with her ritual. The phone rang at that moment, sharp in the quiet room. Miss Marple lifted the receiver. Miss Marple, came Inspector Cray's voice, crackling faintly. I've just had the forensic team back in touch. They analysed the residue from the cup again. It's not tea. At least not entirely. There are compounds in it not found in any conventional blend. They're looking into plant alkaloids. Thank you, Inspector, she said softly. Would you ask them to compare it to unrefined cane sugar substitutes, possibly imported from Madeira? There was a pause. You think it was meant to harm her? No, Miss Marple replied. I think it was meant to make her afraid, but someone else ensured she never had the chance to taste it. She hung up and sat very still. Veronica had brought the sugar as a test for someone else, but if it had been switched before she even opened the tin, then the intended target had never been her at all. The question now wasn't who killed Veronica Drake. It was, who had she meant to expose, and who had outpaced her to it? The morning after the anonymous note arrived, Miss Marple stood at her window for a long while, watching the village stir awake with its usual illusion of innocence. The milk cart passed with its soft clatter, the church bell gave a sleepy chime, and from the lane beyond the vicarage came the faint squeak of a bicycle, likely young Timothy Crowsley off to the grocer's for his mother. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, a quiet tension threaded itself through the cobbled streets and clipped hedges. The village was holding its breath. Veronica Drake's funeral had been scheduled for Friday. Officially, the death was still unexplained. Unofficially, people had begun speaking in euphemisms. A delicate matter. A terrible loss. Such a shock. But none of them said murder. Not yet. Miss Marple had written 3 more names in her ledger. Timothy Crowsley, because boys on bicycles saw things others didn't. Margaret Hargraves, because she had been standing near the tea tent and always noticed who borrowed which teaspoon. And Reverend Nash, because he had visited Veronica the week before her death, and his expression at Sunday service had been too drawn to be only from grief. She set off that morning, not for the vicarage, but toward the Crowsleys' home, a handsome brick affair just beyond the bakery, with geraniums in the windows, and a small dog that barked at its own reflection. Mrs. Crowsley answered the door with her apron still on and a wooden spoon in hand. "Oh," she said, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Miss Marple, how nice. Is everything all right?" "As right as it can be under the circumstances," Miss Marple said gently. "I was hoping I might speak with Timothy, if he's about. Just a small matter to clear up about the fate." Mrs. Crowsley hesitated. "He's in the back garden, digging a hole for the runner beans." Timothy looked up from the soil as Miss Marple approached, his face pink from effort and his hands already grubby. "I hope you don't mind my interrupting your gardening," she said, crouching slightly to his level. "I wanted to ask you something about the spring fete." He blinked. "Did I do something wrong?" "Not at all. I was just wondering. On Saturday afternoon, you rode your bicycle past the tea tent around 3:30, didn't you?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I was taking a tray of cakes from the back of the hall to the main table. Mum made too many and told me to deliver them before they collapsed." "Did you see anyone near the tea tent then? Anyone who looked like they were in a hurry or acting strangely?" Timothy furrowed his brow. "There was someone crouched by. The table, I think. I thought they'd dropped something. But they didn't pick anything up. They just stood up and walked away when they saw me coming." "Do you remember who it was?" He hesitated. "I think it was Mr. Fitch, Mr. Fitch." "Yes, ma'am. He runs the antique stall. Said he'd been helping stack chairs, but he wasn't near the chairs." Miss Marple patted his shoulder with a warm smile. "You've been very helpful, Timothy. Thank you." She took her leave and made her way slowly back through the village. Lionel Fitch was not a widely trusted man. Polite enough, always courteous, but too slick, too watchful. He dealt in old things and secrets. His shop, Fitch's Finds, sat on the corner of Bridge Lane and always smelled faintly of dust and citrus polish. He lived alone above the shop, and while no one could quite say what he did, beyond appraise silver and mutter about provenance, he seemed always to know more than he should about other people's affairs. Miss Marple entered the shop just before noon. A small bell tinkled overhead. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Lionel Fitch from behind the counter. "Come to browse the spoons again? I've just had a lovely batch in, Dutch, 1890s. Not today, Mr. Fitch," she said, her tone as light as the breeze through the open window. "I was just wondering how you've been sleeping." He gave a short, uncertain laugh. "Sleeping? Perfectly well, thank you. Why?" "Oh, no reason. Only I find that people who see terrible things tend not to sleep very soundly, especially when they've been somewhere they ought not to be." His smile faltered. "I don't follow." "You were seen near the tea tent on Saturday," she said mildly. "Shortly before Veronica Drake became upset. You weren't carrying chairs. You were crouched beside the service table. He blinked. "I thought I'd dropped a cufflink. One of the silver ones. I often wear them to the fete. But you weren't wearing them that day. I noticed. You had rolled sleeves. Rather an informal look for you." He stared at her, saying nothing. "You took the pot," Miss Marple said softly. Still no answer. She allowed a moment to pass in silence before continuing. "Not to kill her. I don't believe you meant for her to die. I think you meant to discredit her. You thought she would accuse someone you wanted to protect. So you took the pot and perhaps even tampered with the sugar tin, just enough to make her look erratic. You thought she'd make a scene and be dismissed, but you underestimated what fear can do to the heart." He sank onto the stool behind the counter, his face suddenly grey. "I thought she'd cry wolf. Again. She'd done it before, you know. Always waving letters around, claiming she knew things. And what did she know?" He looked up. "Something about the Nash family, from years ago, about the vicar's father. Something to do with a will and land deeds. I never asked. I just knew she meant to go public." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "And why protect the Nash family, Mr. Fitch?" He hesitated. "Because they helped me, years ago. When I was very young and very stupid, I sold a forgery without knowing it. Reverend Nash, well, he convinced the buyer to drop it. He never spoke of it again. I owe him. And you thought tampering with a teapot would settle the debt." He looked at his hands. "I didn't poison her. I only meant to stop the scene." "I believe you," Miss Marple said gently. "But you must come forward. You have to tell Inspector Cray. I'll be arrested. Perhaps, or perhaps the law will see intent where it lies. But if you don't, Mr. Fitch, the wrong person may take the blame, and I think Veronica Drake has already paid the full price." He said nothing more. But that afternoon, a quiet knock came at the station door, and Lionel Fitch walked inside with a paper-wrapped parcel and a quiet, broken confession. The pot had been hidden behind a loose panel in his shop wall. The sugar tin had indeed been emptied, its contents scattered in the bin behind the greengrocer's, replaced with raw sugar from his own pantry. He had acted alone. But what he didn't know, what Miss Marple did not yet say, was that Veronica Drake had not brought that sugar for him. He had interfered in a scheme that was never meant for him to interrupt. The person Veronica had truly intended to expose still walked the lanes of Lower Hemsby, and they had let her die with the stillness of someone who had done it before. The news of Lionel Fitch's confession settled over Lower Hemsby like a long-awaited rain, quiet, relieving in its neatness, and yet ultimately unsatisfying. Most villagers absorbed it with the eager certainty of people grateful to draw a line under a mystery they could neither understand nor stomach. A few muttered about shame, about clever hands turning dishonest, about how disappointment always came from those you least expected. Only a very few, those who had lived long enough to see the world repeat its patterns, were not quite ready to exhale. Miss Marple sat in her parlour the next morning, a fresh envelope open on her lap, and the soft sound of birdsong filtering through the cracked window pane. The letter inside was from her contact at the county records office, a man who had never been what one might call hasty, but whose diligence had served her well over the years. The summary was brief, but devastatingly precise. Veronica Drake's father, Edward Drake, had served as legal counsel for the Nash family estate during the late 1930s. In 1940, he had been witness to a codicil, one that altered the terms of a land inheritance. The land in question had been part of an old parish bequest, intended originally to fund schooling for village children, but that codicil had transferred ownership to a private holding, quietly sold to the Nash family under another name. A deed filed, witnessed, and then hidden by a man who died less than a year later. The details were murky. The implications were not. Reverend Nash had grown up on land that should never have belonged to his family. Miss Marple folded the letter with delicate care. She remembered the first time she had seen Reverend Nash as a young man. Tall, serene, just back from seminary, with a voice that always sounded one breath away from prayer. He had inherited not just the vicarage, but the quiet reverence of a village that saw him as the last honest relic of a simpler time. And now, she thought. Veronica had returned with papers, perhaps even the original codicil. Enough to upend the Nash family legacy. Enough to ruin reputations, unearth shame, perhaps even incite restitution. But it was not Fitch she had meant to trap. It had been Nash all along. She walked slowly to the mantel and touched the edge of the small clock ticking there. The face was cracked faintly, a thin seam running through the 7. The day it had cracked, 11 years ago, was the day she had watched Reverend Nash bury his mother, solemn and unreadable. Veronica had attended the service too, silent at the back, her face shuttered. Miss Marple had thought, even then, that something unspoken passed between them. At 2:30, she walked the lane toward the vicarage, her cane tapping lightly on the path. The sky was veiled in pale cloud, and the faint scent of turned soil hung in the breeze. The front door opened before she had even lifted her hand to knock. Reverend Nash stood in the threshold, his mouth drawing into something close to a smile, but not quite reaching the eyes. "Miss Marple," he said gently, "I thought perhaps you would come." "I thought perhaps you expected me," she replied, her tone even. He stepped aside, gesturing her into the front room, where the windows looked out over the vicarage garden. Neat rows of lettuces and sage, the bench beneath the hawthorn tree recently scrubbed. The room was quiet, save for the slow hiss of the kettle in the adjoining kitchen. "Will you have tea?" "I think it would be fitting," she said, lowering herself into a worn wingback armchair. "Though I confess, it's not what I came for." He nodded, poured 2 cups, and brought one to her. She did not sip. Neither did he. "You know why she came back," she said quietly. "Yes." "You knew she intended to reveal what your father had done." "Yes." "Did she show you the documents?" "She didn't need to. I've known of them for years." That made Miss Marple pause. "And you did nothing?" Reverend Nash turned his cup in his hands. "My father died before I understood what he had done. By the time I knew, the land was already built upon. That school was never erected. The money, if it existed, was spent, divided, buried in trusts and titles I couldn't trace. I believed that silence would preserve more peace than justice would restore." "And you believed it until Veronica returned." "She came to me, you know, quietly, a week before the fete. She said she had copies of everything, that she would give me time. 1 week. Then she would bring it to the parish council." "What did you say to her?" "I said I would think." "And did you?" "Yes. I thought about shame, about legacy, about what it would do to the people who still believe in my name, my sermons, my God." His voice did not waver, but there was an edge beneath it, something deeper than weariness. "I did not kill her, Miss Marple." "I believe you," she said softly, "but someone else did. Or rather, someone saw the opportunity to let her die before you could stop her. Perhaps someone who loved you, or who had something to lose if your name was dragged through the mud." He looked away, toward the hawthorn tree. "I have no wife, no children. There is no one to protect me." "No one obvious," she said. "But someone always stands to gain when truth is buried." Veronica wasn't silenced with violence. She was undone with doubt. The pot was taken, the sugar tampered with, her message obscured. Fitch admitted to the act, but not the intention. That didn't come from him. And now I wonder, who else knew of the documents? Who else might have overheard your meeting with Veronica? He closed his eyes. "My sister." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. He exhaled slowly. "She was visiting. Margaret. You've met her. She came down to help organize the choir. She was upstairs when Veronica came. I assumed she wasn't listening. But she always listens. She has lived in our father's shadow all her life. This parish is her entire identity. She would do anything to preserve it. Even poison a tin of sugar meant to expose the truth? I don't know. But if anyone could find something obscure and bitter enough to harm someone with fear alone, it would be Margaret. She was a botanist once, briefly. Miss Marple sat very still. Reverend Nash looked down at his tea. "Do what you must." "I intend to," she said. "But this is no longer about punishment. This is about understanding why Veronica believed she had to do it this way. Why she turned to ritual, tea, sugar, ceremony, rather than simply speak." "Because people wouldn't listen," Nash said quietly. "Unless you make them afraid." She tried kindness, she tried letters, she tried silence. But in the end, the only way to rattle the village was to threaten its comforts. "And it worked," Miss Marple murmured. "Too well." She left him there, still seated with his cold cup, and walked back into the hush of the late afternoon. The village lay before her, lovely and bruised. She knew now who had finished what Veronica had begun. The next step was simple, though it would require delicacy. Margaret Nash had been missing from choir practice that morning. And Miss Marple, who had seen enough over the years to know when someone was no longer hiding but running, adjusted her gloves and stepped once more into the gathering dusk. The following morning, the sky above Lower Hemsby had lost its colour, hung over with the kind of soft, stifling grey that made sound travel strangely and footsteps seem louder than they were. The hedgerows were still, the birds cautious in their song. There was no breeze, and the whole village felt as though it had drawn breath and forgotten to release it. Miss Marple stood by her front gate in a light wool coat, her gloves fastened neatly at the wrist, her eyes scanning the lane as if she were waiting for a reply not yet posted. She had made 2 decisions before rising. 1, that Margaret Nash had left something behind, and 2, that it would not remain hidden long. When the postman arrived, late, grumbling, and with wet cuffs from the morning dew, he handed her the usual stack of letters and 1 envelope, not addressed to her at all. "This was slipped through the chapel door," he muttered. "Had your name written beneath it. Figured I ought to deliver it." Miss Marple accepted it without visible surprise, though she turned the envelope over carefully. The handwriting was stiff and angular, the kind one learns in school and never quite softens with time. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper. The ink had bled slightly, as if written with a trembling hand. "I didn't mean for her to die. I only meant to stop her. To stop the harm from spreading. My brother has suffered enough. This parish cannot survive another scandal. You know what they'll say. You know how they'll look at him. At us. Please, Jane, let the dead bury the dead. Monsieur." Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. She did not smile, nor frown. The tone of the message was neither panicked nor apologetic. It was resolute, edged with a strange sort of pride. Margaret Nash had written not out of guilt, but out of fear. Not fear of justice, but of exposure. And there was still the matter of how she'd done it. It had been clever, subtle, and, above all, quick. The sugar tin was the key. Veronica had brought it to the fete, perhaps intending to offer someone a drink spiked with something to expose them, but the contents had been replaced. Not with poison. No autopsy had shown toxins, but with something Veronica herself must have suspected the moment she opened it. Fear. That was the tool Margaret had used. Veronica had believed she might be poisoned, and her body had responded as if she were. The mind could do strange things when given just enough suggestion, especially in someone already burdened by secrets, guilt, or dread. Miss Marple tucked the note into her handbag and made her way slowly toward the church, her cane tapping faintly as she passed shuttered windows and flower boxes left unattended. Reverend Nash was in the churchyard, speaking quietly to the groundskeeper, who stepped away when he saw her approach. "I wasn't sure you would come," Nash said softly. "She's gone," Miss Marple replied. "Left the village sometime before sunrise. Likely took the 5:12 from Wexham. There's a bed and breakfast in Hereford she once visited. One that doesn't ask questions if your bags are light and your eyes red-rimmed. She wrote to you? Yes. He looked away, the bones in his face drawn taut. Then you know. I know what she thinks she did. I also know she didn't poison anyone. But she set a trap all the same. She created the illusion of danger, replaced Veronica's so-called test with her own, and gambled that fear would be enough to silence her. And it was. Miss Marple said nothing. Reverend Nash turned back toward the chapel door. Will you give her name to the inspector? I haven't decided yet, she said quietly. Justice isn't always a matter of law. Sometimes it's a matter of consequence. Margaret has run from something she once protected. That will cost her more than you realize. She protected me. She protected the illusion of you. But perhaps now you can begin to live without the burden of your father's shadow. They stood in silence for a moment more, until the tolling of the church bell for the mid-morning hour stirred the birds in the rafters and broke the hush. Miss Marple walked back through the village, her thoughts weaving themselves as carefully as lace. It was not a tidy ending, but it was a human one, and that, she had learned long ago, was often the best one could hope for. At the corner of Finch Lane, she saw Mrs. Weatherby crouched at her flower bed, patting soil into place around a young dahlia. The woman looked up as Miss Marple passed and gave a sharp nod. Terrible about Fitch, wasn't it? Miss Marple paused. Yes, though I believe he told the truth. Mrs. Weatherby sniffed. I expect he did. Never could keep secrets, that man. Always fiddling with brass knobs and little boxes. But I suppose the whole business is finished now. Thank goodness. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, though finished things have a curious habit of opening themselves again when left unattended. She continued down the lane, leaving behind the scent of disturbed earth and daffodils in bloom. The next day, the newspaper would print a small notice stating that the case of Veronica Drake had been resolved. Death by natural causes, with no evidence of foul play. Lionel Fitch, though charged with obstruction and theft, had been released on probation. No one would mention the tea, or the sugar, or the note left behind in a woman's stiff, fearful hand. But Miss Marple would remember. As she sat that evening beneath her small reading lamp, the fire glowing low and the kettle whistling softly, she turned again to her notebook. She wrote no names, no accusations, only one small observation. Truth does not vanish. It waits. Sometimes behind teacups, sometimes behind shame, but always it waits. She closed the book, poured herself a cup of tea, and for the first time in a long while, added no sugar. The village settled again, or at least performed the act of it. Lower Hemsby resumed its gentle rhythm, the school bell ringing precisely at 9, the scent of toasted barley wafting from the bakery by past, and the parish notices pinned carefully to the board outside St. Mildred's. There was talk of a summer pageant, of a new reverend's wife from Hampshire, who had an excellent alto voice, and even of a lost cat, though the cat had not, in fact, been lost, only sleeping in the bottom drawer of the greengrocer's storeroom. People wanted so desperately for life to feel normal again that they clung to it with the grim cheer of survivors. But Miss Marple knew the performance of peace when she saw it. The polite silence. The sudden change in subject when the word Veronica so much as hovered near a sentence. Even the shape of the days had altered. Mrs. Finch no longer lingered at the postbox. Mr. Sims took longer than usual with the bread delivery, and Madge Harmon had been seen scrubbing her windows twice in the same week, a clear sign, to anyone who knew her, of a mind turning over something unpleasant. Miss Marple had no intention of disturbing the village's fragile equilibrium, but she had not yet put away her notes, and that alone told her she was not finished. The letter from Margaret Nash still sat in her writing desk, folded twice and pressed beneath a ceramic dish painted with violets. Miss Marple had reread it once each morning, and each time the wording became more telling. It wasn't only fear Margaret had written with, it was control. She had believed, almost arrogantly, that her act would restore balance, not destroy it. That by silencing Veronica, She could keep the illusion intact. But illusions fray in unexpected places. On Thursday morning, the air was oddly warm for April, and the smell of damp earth rose from every patch of lawn. Miss Marple dressed slowly, selected a hat with a pale lavender ribbon, and set out toward the south end of the village. She walked the long way round, taking a detour through the cemetery, not for the sake of sentiment, but because she had learned long ago that people spoke more freely near the dead. She found Margaret Nash at her father's grave. Margaret did not look startled to see her. She simply stood, straight-backed and dry-eyed, one gloved hand resting against the headstone. The wind stirred her coat, and for a moment the two women stood in silence, surrounded by crocuses and the soft hum of bees among the ivy. "I wondered if you'd find me here," Margaret said eventually. "You left before the police could," Miss Marple replied. Margaret turned slightly, but not enough to meet her eyes. "I thought you'd prefer it. A quiet exit. No fuss. Just gone." "I've never believed disappearance solved anything," said Miss Marple gently. "It only postpones the reckoning. I didn't poison her. Number. But you meant her to believe she had been. You knew she'd brought the sugar as a test, that she intended to confront someone, and you replaced it." Margaret's jaw tensed. She would have ruined Edward. This whole village would have turned on him. He spent his life trying to serve them, and they would have torn him apart to see that he'd been born into privilege stolen from others. Do you think they would have listened to context? To history? "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that people will listen if they are given truth before shame." "You're wrong," Margaret snapped, turning now, her face pale and tired. "They only listen to scandal. She would have stood at the parish meeting and announced it like theatre, and you would have sat there, with that quiet face of yours, already knowing. I saw it in your eyes the week she returned. You knew something. You always do." Miss Marple did not deny it. Margaret went on, her voice hardening. "She threatened him. Not with police or papers, but with the truth. She said she'd give him the chance to confess. As though she were some judge, as though her father's signature didn't make him complicit. She didn't want to punish him," Miss Marple said. "She wanted to be heard. She wanted to restore something. The land, perhaps, or her father's honor, or her own. She wanted to destroy us. She wanted to end the lie. That's not the same thing." Margaret's silence told its own story. Miss Marple took a slow breath. "You switched the sugar not to kill her, but to unravel her in front of everyone, to make her look mad. And Lionel Fitch, thinking he was saving someone else entirely, took the teapot, and you let it all unfold. She died of fright." "She died," Miss Marple said gently, "because no one let her live in truth." Margaret turned back to the grave, her gloved hand drifting over the engraved dates. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend," said Miss Marple, "to let Inspector Cray know what I believe, and I will tell him what you just told me." Margaret nodded, almost imperceptibly. "He won't arrest me." "No," said Miss Marple, "but he will speak with you, and after that, the village will know. Not the full story, but enough, and it will begin to forget you." The wind picked up slightly, and Margaret shivered. Miss Marple walked away without another word. It was evening by the time the inspector came to call. He stood in the entryway of Miss Marple's home, hat in hand, the lines at the corners of his mouth pulled tight. "She confessed?" "Not in so many words," Miss Marple replied, "but enough for the truth to step in. She'll never be charged." Number. There's no statute for fear, only for action. And Fitch, he did what he confessed to, no more. He'll pay his price, but not with prison. He'll leave the village. Quietly. Cray exhaled. "And you?" "I shall go on," she said simply. "There will be another fate, another cake judging, another whisper behind the churchyard wall. Life insists on going forward." The inspector left shortly after, and Miss Marple watched his figure vanish into the darkening lane. She returned to her sitting room, drew the curtains, and sat by the fire with her knitting. The room was quiet, but not still. There was movement in the coals, in the click of the needles, in the pages of the ledger tucked into the shelf behind her. She had written the truth there. Not for the world, but for the record. For the part of Lower Hemsby that still held its breath. For Veronica Drake, who had tried to speak. And for those who would one day wonder why the village's sugar bowls were quietly replaced, all in the span of a month, with sealed packets that bore no names. Miss Marple sipped her tea, still unsweetened, still watching. The following week passed with a sense of quiet rearrangement, as though the village had collectively moved a step sideways without acknowledging it. The air grew clearer as April waned, and a few early swallows darted across the morning sky, breaking the hush in brief flashes of movement. Lawns were trimmed with more intention. Postmasters folded envelopes with unnecessary care, and the clink of teaspoons in teacups, so innocuous to an outsider, now carried an almost solemn weight. Miss Marple, however, had resumed her customary rhythm with only the faintest outward alteration. She still walked her route along the upper lane toward the green, still selected produce with discernment from the market table, still paused to inquire after the health of ailing roses or strained wrists. But in her mind, the details of the case, Veronica's expression, Lionel Fitch's twitching hands, Margaret Nash's stillness at her father's grave, continued to turn like embroidery in a hoop, each stitch a little tighter, a little clearer. It was during her Thursday visit to the library, a modest room adjoining the town hall where dust settled in vertical strips across the windows, that she discovered the final detail that had eluded her. Mrs. Pike, the librarian, was restocking the shelf of local histories when Miss Marple approached. "I was hoping," she said, "you might still have the parish newsletters from 1940. Mrs. Pike gave her a skeptical glance. "We keep them for reference, of course. But no one's touched those in years. What on earth for?" "Something I've been puzzling over," said Miss Marple with a small smile. "I've always found that old records hold their own sort of answers." Mrs. Pike obliged, disappearing into the side room and returning with a folder labelled Parish Notes, 1939 to 1941, its edges soft from age. Miss Marple sat down at the reading table beneath the window and turned the pages slowly. She wasn't looking for headlines. What she sought was finer than that, an omission, a contradiction, a name that should not have appeared and yet did. Her fingers paused on the March 1940 edition, where a modest paragraph welcomed Edward Drake back from an illness abroad. His return had been just in time, it said, to act as legal witness in a matter of parish land. That land, Miss Marple knew from the county letter, had been transferred weeks earlier. She turned the page, and there, in the April newsletter, buried among notices of choir rehearsals and announcements of births, was a small thank you note from Margaret Nash, then a young woman of 22, thanking the parish council for their support of father's decision to retire some holdings for private use. Miss Marple read the sentence twice. Margaret had known. Not only that, she had participated in the deception. The decision hadn't only come from Edward Nash, it had been jointly enacted. And all these years later, it was not simply her brother's name she had protected. It was her own. She closed the folder quietly and returned it to Mrs. Pike with a nod. "I think that's all I needed, thank you." As she walked home, a light breeze stirred the hedges, and Miss Marple felt the shift inside her take hold at last. Margaret's motives had always seemed tightly woven around her brother, but now Miss Marple saw it more plainly. Margaret's actions had been a reinforcement of a structure she herself had helped build. To let Veronica speak would not only have toppled Edward, it would have exposed her as the architect of her father's final deceit, a quiet betrayal buried in committee minutes and sealed with polite signatures, and Veronica had known. Perhaps not the full extent, but enough. By the time Miss Marple reached her gate, she was resolved. She entered her cottage, removed her gloves, and sat down at her writing desk. She wrote 2 letters. The first was to Inspector Cray. In it, she laid out her findings with clinical care, the language in the parish notes, the timeline from the county office, and Margaret Nash's lifelong involvement in parish finance and land management. She did not demand action. Miss Marple never presumed to instruct the law, but she offered a picture, not one of violence or premeditated malice, but of quiet orchestration. Margaret had not acted alone in 1940, and she had not panicked when Veronica returned. She had defended something she had helped build. The second letter, far shorter, was addressed to Reverend Nash. It contained only 1 line. There are debts we inherit and debts we choose to uphold. I believe you have begun to know the difference. She signed both, sealed them, and walked them to the postbox herself. That night, the moon rose over Lower Hemsby in full, pale quiet. No wind disturbed the hedgerows, and no lights flickered in the vicarage windows. Miss Marple sat by her fire and let this stillness settle around her, neither comforting nor ominous, merely final. 2 days later, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Reverend Nash. He stood at her doorstep, hat in hand, collar slightly wilted from walking in the late spring warmth. His expression was not that of a man preparing to confess, but rather of one preparing to understand. She invited him in. "I've spoken to Margaret," he said. "She hasn't denied it. She's calm, unapologetic, but not unkind. She believes she preserved something." "She did," he said quietly. "A legacy that was never ours to claim. And I stood inside it like a borrowed house, convinced that silence was stewardship." Miss Marple nodded. "And now?" "She's going away. Not just from the village. She's going to Dorset, to stay with an old friend from university. I think she needs to become someone else for a while. And you?" "I'm staying," he said. "But I won't be preaching. Not until I know I can speak without fear of what my silence allowed." Miss Marple offered him a cup of tea. He declined sugar. When he left, he did so with something like peace in his stride, though he was a man forever altered. That, too, was a kind of justice, not punishment, but transformation. The following week, the church pews were dusted for a service that would be delivered by a visiting vicar. The Women's Guild met to plan a summer planting day. A new girl began sorting books at the library, and the people of Lower Hemsby, though still careful in their speech, began to wear their silences more lightly. In her sitting room, Miss Marple finished knitting a scarf in soft grey wool and placed it beside a neat pile of others for the church bazaar. The final skein had been a gift from Veronica Drake the year before, brought back from her travels, undyed, resilient, and a little coarse to the touch. Like Veronica herself, she thought. The notebook was placed back on its shelf. The truth once more had waited, and now it could rest. The morning air drifted soft and pale over Lower Hemsby, as if the village itself were breathing out after a long-held breath. Daffodils nodded gently in the light breeze, and birds called back and forth between chimney pots and sycamores, no longer cautious in their song. The parish notice board had been changed, the summer sewing circle dates updated in firm pencil, a note pinned discreetly about the flower rota, and in the window of the post office, someone had placed a modest bouquet of lilac in a jam jar. Miss Marple stood at her window, a half-drunk cup of tea cooling in her hand. From this vantage point, she could see across the green toward the church path, where Mrs. Weatherby was speaking to young Timothy Crowsley, who seemed to be politely trying to edge away. Miss Marple watched their silhouettes for a moment, then set down the cup and returned to her writing desk. The ledger had remained open for days now. Its pages, neatly inscribed in Miss Marple's fine hand, bore no declarations and no official accusations, only observations, fragments, and the quiet sequencing of human behavior that had long replaced any need for dramatic proofs. She made one final notation beneath the last entry, written as always in the careful tone of someone who was not writing for drama, but for clarity. Not all lies are spoken aloud. Some are built in silence, brick by brick. When dismantled, they do not collapse. They drift apart like mist, and it is only then that we see what they concealed. Satisfied, she closed the book. There was a knock at the front door shortly after midday. When she opened it, it was not who she expected. Margaret Nash stood on the threshold in her travelling coat, hair pinned back as tightly as ever, but her expression was softer now, as if some of the iron had bled out of her spine. A small valise sat beside her boots. Miss Marple noted its size, just enough for a week or two, no more. "I thought I ought to say goodbye," Margaret said. Miss Marple stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "You're going, then?" "Dorset first," Margaret replied, walking slowly into the sitting room. "I've arranged to stay with Eleanor Price. She was in my year at Girton. Still runs her little herbarium, though she lost her hearing in one ear and can't abide noisy markets." Miss Marple nodded, seating herself in the chair nearest the fireplace. "You'll be of use to her, I expect." "I hope so," Margaret said. Then, after a pause, "I didn't think you'd forgive me." "I haven't," said Miss Marple, without malice. "But I do understand you." Margaret looked away. "Veronica came to me first, you know, before she ever approached Edward. She brought the papers, laid them out like a ledger. She wanted a correction, not vengeance. She said, if we can't undo it, we can at least stop pretending. But all I heard was that she meant to expose the whole thing." Miss Marple said nothing. She had always found that silence, when properly timed, was far more unsettling than any rebuke. "I told her I'd think about it," Margaret went on. "But the moment she left, I knew I wouldn't let her speak. Not because of Edward, not even because of father, but because it would have made everything we built feel false. The meetings, the committees, the hours we gave to this village, all balanced on a lie. I couldn't bear it." "It wasn't false," Miss Marple said gently. "It was simply incomplete, and truth doesn't erase what's been done well. It only clarifies what has been done wrong." Margaret gave a small, bitter laugh. "You sound like her. Then perhaps you should have listened to her." There was a long silence. Then Margaret stood, straightened her coat, and lifted the small valise. "Will you tell them?" "I already have," Miss Marple said. "What I believe, but I doubt they'll say your name, aloud. Not out of kindness, but out of habit. Villagers prefer their truths folded neatly, like linens, not paraded." Margaret nodded. "Still, I suppose that's mercy." "Not mercy," Miss Marple replied, rising with her. "Just time." Margaret lingered in the doorway for a moment longer. "Thank you," she said, though it carried no expectation of absolution. Miss Marple closed the door behind her, then stood a moment in the quiet that followed. The clock ticked softly on the mantel, and the tea had gone cold, but the air in the room felt lighter now, less like the weight of something held back, and more like the residue of something finally said. She took her shawl from the peg and stepped into the garden. The rosemary was beginning to bud along the path, and the lilies had pushed through at last in the shaded corner near the bench. She ran her hand gently over the hedge, then paused at the trellis, where a spider had built a new web overnight, its threads delicate, glinting, and absolutely precise. Later that afternoon, she received a short envelope from Reverend Nash. Inside was a single line, handwritten on unlined paper. "The school fund has been reopened. The land will be returned to its intended purpose." She was right to remind us. There was no signature. None was needed. That evening, as the sun bent low behind the chimneys, the light stretching across the lane in long gold stripes, Miss Marple lit the first candle of the season and set it in the window. Not as a symbol, not for remembrance, and certainly not for mourning. Only to see what might be revealed in the stillness that came after everything else had passed. The village carried on, as it always had, but this time it carried the truth with it. The final Sunday in April arrived clear and cool, with a sharpness in the wind that hinted at May's approach. Lower Hemsby dressed itself in subtle colour, fresh petals on the altar, newly pressed trousers on the men, and a vase of bluebells on the table inside the church hall. There was no announcement, no printed statement, no dramatic reckoning. But those who paid attention noticed that Margaret Nash's name no longer appeared on the flower rota, and though Reverend Nash resumed his duties, his sermons took on a quieter tone, more questions than answers, more listening than instructing. Miss Marple, having attended the morning service and exchanged a few gentle pleasantries in the churchyard, walked slowly home with the late sun warming her shoulder. There was no urgency to her step. Nothing in her expression gave away that the story had ended, because in truth, it had not ended at all. It had simply resolved. Veronica Drake had tried to deliver the truth not through confrontation, but through ritual. A pot of tea, a tin of sugar, a village fete. She had understood something about people, about how they listened more closely to symbols than to speech. And when those symbols were stolen, when the pot vanished, and the sugar was swapped, she had faced what she believed to be betrayal on every front. The fear, buried so long beneath purpose, had risen, and her body had yielded to it. Her death had been quiet, unwitnessed, but it had not been in vain. Miss Marple had seen the truth through Veronica's eyes, and that was enough. In her sitting room, she laid out the final letter she had kept sealed since Margaret's departure. It had arrived the morning before, sent from Dorset. The paper was plain, the writing steadier than before. You were right. The lie was mine too. I have begun telling Eleanor the truth, one piece at a time. She listens. I never realized how much I needed someone to listen without flinching. Perhaps one day I'll come home. But not yet. Not until I know how to walk through the village without pretending. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it beside the copy of the county records that had started it all. She did not need to read either again. The truth, once revealed, did not require rehearsal. Outside, a child called out in the lane, the sound bright and thin. A bicycle bell rang twice. Somewhere nearby, someone was pruning roses too early, and a wren was scolding them for the disruption. Miss Marple drew her curtains gently and poured one final cup of tea. No sugar, not any more. As the sky dimmed and the lamps lit up one by one across the green, Miss Marple sat in her chair, her knitting untouched in her lap. Her thoughts wandered not to Margaret, nor Veronica, nor even to the Reverend and his trembling hands. Instead, she thought of the quiet resilience of a village like Lower Hemsby, how it withstood truths, concealed them, revealed them again, then settled into new forms like bread rising in an oven. Never quite the same, but always nourishing. She had done what she could. The rest was up to time, and time, Miss Marple knew, always steeped the truth, eventually.